Hey, how you doing? It's Joshua Bishop. Today I want to talk to you about a strange pattern I've noticed that connects several seemingly different interests of mine: quantum computers, 16th century historical figures, and the metaphysics of symbolic substitution. In the 1500s, the arguably best scientist in the world was a man named John Dee. He was a mathematician, astronomer, chemist, advisor, and spymaster for Queen Elizabeth. He had one of the largest libraries in England at that time. He's credited with coining the term British Empire and the idea of founding English colonies in America, and the rest of the New World was largely his. He signed his letters to the Queen 007, the two circles symbolizing the eyes of the Queen, for your eyes only, and 7 was his lucky number. This is the origin of James Bond being 007, because Ian Fleming was aware of John Dee's history. He studied with Mercator, one of the fathers of mapping, and he developed new instruments and techniques for astronomy and navigation. Mathematics was central to how he approached the world and science. At that time, the idea of viewing the world through the lens of mathematics wasn't universal. Scientific concepts weren't expressed mathematically as a matter of course yet at that time in history. He was also very well versed in the early concepts of cryptography. He was friends with Tycho Brahe, who was a world-renowned astronomer. He also used Copernican theory in his work on calendars, and was a part of the reason for the adoption of the Gregorian calendar in England. One thing to understand is that many scientists between the 1500s and the 1700s were also alchemists and occultists, especially Neoplatonists and Hermeticists. The lines between these things were very blurry in the past, maybe somewhat blurry now, but not as much discussed. There's an interesting paper published on the NIH PubMed website called John Dee and the Sciences, Early Modern Networks of Knowledge, that goes into him a little bit more in depth. In his life, Dee was obsessed with a couple of specific books. One was called the Voynich Manuscript, which is a 15th century codex written in an unknown language, and that has many illustrations depicting unknown plants and animals. Many people believe that the book is written in a type of code, and in recent years there have been efforts to decrypt this book, some of them partially successful. The second book that Dee was obsessed with is called the Book of Soyga, which is also known as the Book That Kills. The legend behind this book states that whoever is able to decode the book will die within 2.5 years. Kind of a disincentive to figuring out the book. This book contains 40,000 randomly distributed letters, mostly set up in large tables. Dee spent years trying to decode these letters. Now, this context will be important later on in this show. Alright, before we continue on with Dr. Dee and his books, I need to talk a little bit about the concept of symbolic substitution. This concept is used all over the world in many different ways, from mathematics to advertising to metaphysics. There's an old trope in the sciences where, for example, a biologist might say, "My field explains life." But then a chemist can say, "Well, my field explains biology," because biological processes are largely a product of chemistry. But then a physicist can say, "Well, I explain chemistry because all chemical interactions are a result of physics." Mathematicians will then say that they trump all of these because all of it is described and expressed using mathematics. However, I will add my own layer to this joke, which is that symbolism trumps math because math is made up of symbols. I'll tell you a quick story about a PhD mathematician friend of mine. He told me when he was in college he was trying to decide whether to major in physics or mathematics. He was doing a class project where he had to observe and measure something like the electrical resistance of a particular metal depending on its temperature. He was supposed to conduct the experiment and record the results. However, in his head, he had it backwards from what the textbook and science says it should be. So he thought the resistance would go up when it got one temperature and that it would go down when it got a different temperature. So he performed the experiment, recorded his results, and then looked it up and saw that his results matched his belief rather than what it was supposed to be. He asked his instructor how this could have happened, and his instructor said he didn't know, maybe some kind of quantum effect of the observer affecting what was being observed. In that moment, my friend decided to major in mathematics, because a formula or a rule is set and not malleable by belief or observation. And he likes a universe that follows a set of rules. I personally probably would have majored in physics if I was in his shoes, because I like things to be interesting and unpredictable. Now, when you were young, you were shown how physical objects relate to numbers. For example, you might be shown a picture of 2 apples, and then told about the number 2, and shown how the number 2 represents these 2 apples. The number 2 is a symbol that we draw to represent the concept of 2 items. The idea itself of 2 items is a symbolic concept that represents more than 1 item but less than 3 items. If you remember the basic algebra that you were taught in school, you would have seen the concept of using a letter to represent whatever number is needed for a particular equation. For example, x equals 10. Once you grasp the idea of substituting the characters of the number 10 for 10 objects, then at the next level, substituting the letter x for the number 10, which represents the concept of 10 items. Once you've gotten that down, you can work with these symbols in an equation. For example, x plus 5 equals 15. Once you understand how to manipulate the symbols, you know that in this case, x equals 10. 10 plus 5 equals 15. But you also know that x is malleable depending on what the other numbers or symbols are used in the equation. If we change the 5 to a 6, that changes what x is. If we change the plus to a minus, that also changes what x is. We can extrapolate many levels of complexity from this idea of one thing that can stand in to represent another. And you can even chain multiple levels of symbolic substitution. Now, this idea of symbolic substitution can get very complex. Images can represent collections of concepts or even whole books worth of information. For example, let's take the classic symbol of the devil, the red guy with goat feet, horns, and a pitchfork. The symbols derive mostly from John Milton's Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno, as well as from the old Greek god Pan. And this image is a symbol that represents a sort of distilled idea of evil. When you look at the picture of the devil, your mind automatically evokes the concept associated. Let's add another layer to this idea. As I said before, symbols can be chained together, each one representing the other. This is often called symbolic correspondences. It's important to understand that in the classical world, these correspondences were widely understood and important, and often connected to archetypes and mythological stories. For example, the color red is a symbol. The color red can represent the planet Mars. The planet Mars can represent the zodiacal sign of Aries. Aries can be represented with tobacco or nettle as plants that correspond to the ideas behind Aries and Mars. The gem ruby is often associated with these symbols as well. Iron classically corresponded with Mars and Aries. And all of these things can stand in symbolically to represent the idea of war. These are the ideas of strife, vengeance, anger, and all of them can be represented by any of these symbols or all of these symbols taken together. Now, to take this idea a bit further, In science, we've developed things called models. Models are a symbol for a thing combined with parameters to help people understand the thing better, and which makes it easier to communicate and transport than the actual real thing. For example, you can't hand someone the entire planet Earth in order to explain the climate to them, but you can create a climate model. You can't hold an atom in your hand and look at it, but you can create a conceptual model of an atom to get some idea of how it functions. A model is the generation of a physical, conceptual, or mathematical representation of a real phenomena. We create all kinds of models in science and other disciplines to help us visualize and understand things. We have grid point models to help understand climate change effects across different parts of the globe. We have the Bohr model of the atom showing the nucleus, the positive and negative charges, the orbits of electrons, etc. We also have the double helix DNA model. And we can have very complicated models such as those used to visualize a nuclear explosion. These might use waves to represent motion and momentum, colors to represent pressure or temperature changes, and other visual aids to represent time domains. If we've been properly trained in the particular discipline, our mind automatically connects up all of the symbolic correspondences related to what we are seeing in the model. Our mind knows pink represents a particular pressure or temperature range. The plus sign represents an electric positive charge. Now I want to describe a system of understanding the world that uses one of the most interesting and widely applicable models I've ever seen. This system is called the Kabbalah. From what I've studied, it seems to have been orally transmitted form of Jewish mysticism. There are hints of it or similarities in many other ancient cultures across the world. One of its first major books is called the Zohar, and it was published in the 13th century in Spain by a man named Moses de Leon. He ascribed the work to another man named Shimon bar Yochai. It's often called the Lurianic Kabbalah after Isaac Luria, who helped develop it further. There is a more modern adaptation of this system called the Hermetic Kabbalah, which blends in alchemy, Gnostic, and Neoplatonic concepts with the Lurianic Kabbalah. I'm not going to go deeply into the mystical aspects of this system in this video, but maybe I will at a later time. For this video, I just want you to understand the core model and what it looks like. The core model is called a tree, even though it looks like a series of interconnecting lines and circles in a sort of diamond-shaped pattern, with the lines making many triangles. Each circle represents a chain of symbolic correspondences, kind of like what I talked about earlier with Mars and Red and War and Aries. One of the circles on this particular tree can stand in to represent that entire chain of symbols. Each line represents the nature of the connection between two circles, so how different chains of symbolic correspondences connect and relate to each other. This model describes the aspects of the self, subdivisions of the nature of God, the solar system, the way symbolic or archetypal correspondences are interconnected. You can take this image and map out all kinds of things to it. For example, you can map out how each of the classical four elements, earth, air, wind, or fire, and water, are positioned on it. You can also take the image and map out each of the planets in the solar system and their relationship to each other's mythological natures. So, Neptune at the top of the tree, Earth at the bottom of the tree, the sun in the center, and all the other planets living in each one of the circles all around. You can also overlay the zodiac, matching each sign of the zodiac to one of the circles and its corresponding planets and chains of symbols. Now, realize that each of these things being overlaid from the zodiac sign to the planets to the elements are also in turn symbols for other ideas and concepts, creating a very complex tool of thought and understanding. There are many more things that can be linked to and understood by this model, but the last one that I'll discuss today is a partial model of the self, or a person's psychology and existence. In this case, the bottom circle represents the body, your physical form. Traveling straight up the tree to the next circle, this one represents the libido, which in this sense is the full creative and desire impulse, not just sexuality. This also represents the unconscious or subconscious mind. This is the mind of dreams, the mind of subconscious impulses. Traveling further up the tree to the left, the next circle represents the intellect, your analytical mind. Going straight across to the right, the next circle is known as the emotional self. Taken all together, these 4 circles are sometimes called the pyramid. And if you look at the model, you can see a downward pointing pyramid formed by the connection of these. The next circle up in the center represents the full integrated self. This is the self where everything is in balance, the motivations and intentions are understood, the impulses are under the will of the person. There are more circles up the tree from there, but we'll stop here. This model was well known and well understood by John Dee in his time, and he used it in his understanding of things. Keep this image in your mind. It will come up later in this talk. And now for something seemingly totally unrelated. In around 2019, I started working at a scientific institution that was one of a handful of places that had a DWAVE quantum computer. At that time, only some defense contractors, NASA, Google, universities, and weapons labs had one of these. I applied for and was granted access to the machine, and I began experimenting and learning how to use it. I very quickly noticed a strange pattern. But before I go further, I'm going to explain a little bit about how the computer works, but not in too much detail as it's pretty complex, and I'm not a physicist, although I read a lot and dabble. My explanation is my best understanding of how it works, but I encourage you to look it up and not take my word for it. The inside of the quantum computer is very cold. The processor consists of a number of micrometer-sized loops of superconducting metal. Along these little loops of what looks like wire are something called Josephson Junctions. There's an effect that happens when 2 superconductors are placed close to each other with some kind of barrier between them. A current is produced that flows across the Josephson junction continuously without any voltage applied. This current is a supercurrent, which is an electric current that flows without dissipating. It goes through the barrier to the other side through a quantum tunnel. These are constructed so that the current will flow continuously when an external magnetic flux is applied in a clockwise or counterclockwise fashion. Now, if you listen to some of the designers of this computer talk, they basically describe it as the computer travels to another dimension where all possible outcomes or answers to the problem that you put into the computer exist. Whichever one of these answers is the most efficient emerges from this dimension into the computer, and the computer gives you the answer to your problem. Now, this computer is not like a typical computer. It doesn't run an operating system and applications like you might be used to on your PC or phone. This computer essentially has an interface where you can input a specific type of problem, and the computer will solve it very quickly for you. An example of the type of problem that it can solve is called the discrete optimization problem. This is when you are trying to find the best solution from all possible solution options. For example, let's say you have to deliver milk in a city that has 7 bridges. There are many ways to go about crossing all of the bridges to reach your different delivery destinations. but there is one way that is most efficient and doesn't require you to cross the bridge more than once. Solving this allows you to find the best and most efficient solution out of a number of possible solutions. There are Web API and Python-based interfaces for interacting with the computer and setting up problems to be solved. The computer then will display the results and graphs to the user, generally through a type of web interface. The computer can also use something called a chimera graph, which represents multiple connected qubits within the computer. The qubits are these little loops of superconducting metal. This allows the user to visualize what is happening within the hardware. One of the creators of the DWAVE is named Geordie Rose. He has a PhD in theoretical physics, was a national wrestling champion, and a world champion in jiu-jitsu. And he's also created a robotics company called Kindred and has been involved in several other companies. He gave a talk at the Tech Vancouver event in 2017 where he talked a bit about DWAVE and then went into his company Kindred and how he wants to build an AI that can do everything that a human can do. In this talk, he calls AIs super intelligent aliens that are coming to our planet probably within the next 13 years. He also quotes Elon Musk, who said at MIT in 2014, "With artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon. You know all those stories where there's the guy with the pentagram and the holy water, and he's like, sure, he can control the demon. Doesn't work out." Geordie Rose says that the word demon doesn't capture what's happening with AI. He then goes on to talk about H.P. Lovecraft and his ideas of cosmic indifference. Basically, that there's these elder gods that don't care about you but are massively powerful. He says that the AI we are summoning are less like demons and more like the Lovecraftian gods, entities that will not necessarily be aligned with what we want as humans. In another talk, one of the founders of DWAVE, Eric Ladzinski, said quantum computers are not a new type of computer. Quantum computers allow us to access hidden features of nature and new dimensions. Geordie Rose has said things about containing angels inside the machines. He calls the DWAVE a black monolith and an altar to alien gods in a 2015 talk. The shadows of these parallel worlds overlap with ours, and if we are smart enough, we can dive into them, grab their resources, and pull them back into ours to make an effect in our world, is a quote from one of his talks. Have you seen the movie Arrival? If not, there's going to be a little bit of spoilers here. In the movie, these giant sort of egg-shaped objects begin appearing all over the world. People and governments start to freak out, and a linguist named Dr. Lois Banks is brought in to try to help communicate with whatever it is. Now, a couple of things I noticed about this movie. The only person who calls the entities in the eggs aliens is Dr. Banks. No one else, not the military or other scientists or anyone, calls them aliens besides her. This is an assumption made by Banks, because there's nothing in the movie to really indicate where these things came from. The other thing that I noticed is that the entities don't seem to live in time the way that we do. And being around them causes Dr. Banks to start to slip in and out of different time sequences and have experiences and visions from the future. The entities seem to give her information from the future and modify reality just by her being around them. There's a book that was attributed to Aristotle, although that's not confirmed and there's some argument about it, called The Causes, which much of its content seems to come from another book by Proclus called Elements of Theology. In De Causis it says, "An intelligence keeps pace with eternity." St. Thomas Aquinas interprets this to mean that, to an angel, past and future are no different. The angel knows each indifferently. Basically, that angels exist outside of time, They don't see it or experience it like we do, as a sort of a drawn-out sequence. I saw some overlap between the creatures in the Arrival movie and some of what is described about angels in these metaphysical and theological texts. These entities give dense amounts of information in a coded language. And the Dr. Banks is supposed to decode this information and figure out what it means. There's an even older movie called Contact, where aliens start to communicate with Earth, and they also do it in a coded form. They provide that doctor with blueprints and instructions on how to build a machine that she could use to travel across the stars to meet with them. This information was in a 3D dimensional table form. In some ways, you could interpret the movie to mean that the travel was performed in her mind rather than physically. So, what does all this have to do with John Dee in the 1500s in the DWAVE? Well, in addition to math, cryptography, and science, John Dee also reported in his diaries that he communicated with angels. He wanted to understand the Book of Soiga, and he wanted to be able to spy, since if you remember, he was a spy master for Queen Elizabeth. He wanted to be able to spy on people without having to travel across Europe. And so he attempted to contact angels to help him with these two goals. He called these angels the Enochian angels, after a biblical figure named Enoch. During the course of this, he states that these angels gave him a bunch of information in the form of tables of letters and numbers, strange symbols and diagrams. They provided him with a different language and alphabet to understand what they were saying. He didn't quite know what to make of it and didn't really put it to use, but he recorded it. Now, if you're watching this on one of the video platforms that I'm available on, such as YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, I'm going to show a series of images. And if you're not, I'll describe them to you as best I can. On the left side of this first image, I'm going to show you some screenshots from the DWAVE interfaces. And on the right side, I'm going to show you images from the Kabbalah, which was involved in Dee's work, as well as from what the Enochian angels gave him. So, the images from the DWAVE are basically a series of spheres with interconnecting lines. And you can see some of the shapes and triangles that these lines make. On the right is the Kabbalistic tree of life, and in a couple of different forms. In one of these forms, you can see that there's a shape traced on the tree that's called the unicursal hexagram. You can also see the same shape traced within the spheres and lines of the DWAVE interface. These two images are extremely similar to each other, almost exactly the same. The next image shows one of the graphical outputs from the DWAVE on the left, and one of the Enochian tables that the angels gave Dee on the right. They also look fairly similar. You can see a pattern emerge. The next image shows a result graph that outputs from the DWAVE when you've given it a problem and it solved it. And on the right, you can see one of the Enochian angelic tables with the various angel names or Enochian dimension names traced on the table. The Enochian angels essentially provided Dee with a map of a series of different dimensions that could be explored mentally. And you use these diagrams to help you do that. Some overlap with the concept of the DWAVE. The final image shows what's called the DWAVE hardware working graph. And on the right is another Enochian table. And if you can see the image, you can see definite similarities. Let's assume for a moment that the angels Dee says he talked to were real, even if they were only real in his mind and not objectively real. I've listened to and read about a lot of scientists whose greatest ideas and contributions came to them under very odd circumstances. Where do these thoughts come from? Are they our ideas, or are we a conduit that the ideas pass through? My last VC-funded tech company was based on an idea I dreamed of, fully formed, Every aspect of the product was in vivid detail in the dream, and it became a reality after a year with a team of programmers. So these angels, regardless if they are objective entities or a psychological construct, because they don't seem to exist in time like we do, could they have been providing D with the software for a computer that wouldn't exist for another 500 years? Is there anything we can learn from D or other scientists with a mystical bent like Isaac Newton, Roger Bacon, Jack Parsons, and many others? Anything we can learn that was ignored for being too metaphysical or out there that we could apply to help us in modern science? Modern science, especially in the realms of AI and quantum computing, is right out there on the edge. I've had the pleasure of being able to talk to many world-class physicists and mathematicians, including eating a sandwich with Nobel Prize winner Murray Gell-Mann at the Santa Fe Institute. And when you listen to them talk about the frontiers of modern science, it sounds very much like Neoplatonic or medieval metaphysics. I was the primary investigator on a funded computer research project where we examined very old computing systems, CPUs that were over 20 years old, discontinued architectures, and we found features that would be super valuable in the modern world but have been forgotten. The oldest computer ever found was the Greek Antikythera device that's over 2,000 years old and can predict astronomical positions decades in advance. What can we learn from these old things? Are the keys to modern technology hanging out in ancient mystical texts? I don't know, but that's the pattern I'm seeing. If you found this video valuable, summon a legion of angels to stomp on the like button and share it with your AI robot friends, and see you on the next show.